The afternoon air crackled with gunfire as Corporal Marcus Johnson dropped to his knees behind the crumbling sandbag wall. September 17, 1967. Con Thien Fire Base, just 2 miles south of the demilitarized zone in Vietnam. His fingers trembled as he frantically twisted the dial on his ANPRC-25 radio, desperately trying to establish contact with the airbase at Da Nang. The North Vietnamese Army had launched a massive artillery barrage followed by waves of infantry against the undermanned Marine position. His unit, Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, was pinned down and rapidly running out of ammunition. The sound of incoming mortars whistled overhead, each explosion sending vibrations through the saturated earth beneath him. "Broken arrow! Broken arrow!" he shouted into the handset, using the emergency code that called for all available air support when a unit was in danger of being overrun. But only static answered him. The firebase's main radio antenna had been destroyed in the initial barrage, and without air support, Con Thien would fall within the hour. Johnson could smell the acrid gunpowder and feel the heat of nearby explosions as dirt rained down on his helmet. His lieutenant lay dead 10 yards away, and the company commander was badly wounded. "Get that damn radio working, Johnson!" Captain Harrison bellowed through bloodied lips, his right arm hanging limp and useless at his side. "We need air support now, or we're all dead men." Johnson's mind raced. The standard protocols weren't working. The handheld radio he clutched simply didn't have the range to reach Da Nang through the thick jungle and rolling hills. But something in his training, something in his past experience with radio equipment sparked an idea. Dangerous, unauthorized, and completely against military communications protocol. He took a deep breath and made a decision. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a coil of copper wire and his combat knife. With steady hands contrasting his racing heart, he began slicing through the radio's protective casing to access the internal antenna connection. "Sir, I need 5 minutes," Johnson shouted to the captain. "I can fix this, but I've got to modify the equipment." "We don't have 5 minutes, Corporal," the captain shot back, wincing in pain. Johnson nodded grimly. "Then I'll do it in 3. As bullets whizzed overhead and explosions rocked the firebase perimeter, no one in the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines knew that one man's defiance of military radio protocol that afternoon would rewrite battlefield communication tactics and save over 200 lives in the bloodied soil of Con Thien. Marcus Johnson wasn't born to be a hero. The third of 5 children, he grew up in the small town of Clarksdale, Mississippi during the 1940s and 50s. His father, Elijah Johnson, worked as a mechanic and part-time radio repairman, often bringing home broken sets for young Marcus to help fix. It was in his father's cramped garage workshop that Marcus first fell in love with electronics, learning how radio waves traveled, how antennas functioned, and how to improvise repairs with limited resources. "Radio waves are just like water in a river," his father would tell him. "They'll always find a path if you give them one. Sometimes you've got to help them along when the usual route is blocked." By the age of 12, Marcus could diagnose and repair most common radio problems in the community, earning a reputation as something of a local prodigy. Despite his clear aptitude for electronics, opportunities for higher education were severely limited for young black men in Mississippi during that era. After graduating high school in 1963, Marcus found himself working alongside his father, repairing electronics, and dreaming of something more. The Vietnam War was escalating, and in early 1965, Marcus made the decision that would change his life. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, seeing it both as a path to eventual education through the GI Bill and as a way to serve a country that had not always served him well. "I'm going to come back and build something," he told his parents the day he left for boot camp. "America needs to see what we can do." Boot camp at Parris Island was brutal for all recruits, but particularly challenging for African American Marines in the 1960s. Though the armed forces had been officially desegregated since 1948, the reality on the ground was far different. Marcus endured racial slurs, extra duties, and the unspoken expectation that he would fail. Instead, he channeled the resilience he'd learned growing up in Mississippi, keeping his head down and excelling in his training, particularly in communications and electronics. "Johnson seems to speak radio better than English," his drill instructor remarked after watching Marcus rapidly disassemble and reassemble field communication equipment in record time. When aptitude tests revealed his exceptional understanding of electronics and communication systems, the Marines assigned him to communications school at Marine Corps Base Quantico. There, Marcus thrived, absorbing everything from Morse code to advanced radio repair. His instructors noted his ability to troubleshoot equipment under pressure and his knack for improvising solutions with minimal resources. Sometimes the book answer isn't the right answer in the field, his communications instructor told the class. You need to understand the principles deeply enough to know when to throw the manual away. Those words would echo in Marcus's mind years later as he knelt in the mud of Contien. After communications school, Marcus was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines as a radio operator. His arrival at his new unit in early 1967 was met with the same skepticism he had encountered throughout his military career. Radio operators held critical positions in combat units, the lifeline between Marines in contact with the enemy and the support they needed to survive. Some of his fellow Marines openly questioned whether a black operator could be trusted with such responsibility. "Don't worry about those guys," Staff Sergeant Mike Collins told him during his first week with the unit. Collins, a veteran radio operator who would become something of a mentor to Marcus, recognized talent when he saw it. "Just do your job better than anyone else could do it. Results shut people up faster than words ever will." And results were what Marcus delivered. During his first 3 months in Vietnam, he developed a reputation for maintaining perfect radio discipline, for keeping his equipment operational in the harsh jungle conditions, and for his uncanny ability to establish communications when others could not. "Johnson's got magic fingers," Marines would say when he managed to coax a signal from a waterlogged radio or repair battle-damaged equipment with scraps. What they didn't know was that Marcus often modified standard equipment in small, unauthorized ways, adjusting impedance settings, reconfiguring ground planes, or slightly altering antenna lengths to optimize performance in Vietnam's challenging terrain. These modifications were technically against regulations, which demanded adherence to standard configurations to maintain system compatibility. But the improvements were subtle enough to escape notice while making his communications more reliable. By September 1967, Marcus had earned the respect of most of his fellow Marines and the trust of his commanding officers. When the battalion was ordered to reinforce the embattled firebase at Contien, he had no idea that soon, those instincts for radio improvisation would be all that stood between his comrades and annihilation. Contien, place of angels, in Vietnamese, was anything but heavenly in the autumn of 1967. The small Marine Corps outpost sat atop a modest hill just 2 miles south of the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam. Its strategic location made it a critical observation post, monitoring North Vietnamese army movements across the border. But that same importance made it a primary target for enemy forces. The firebase was part of what Marines grimly called the McNamara Line, a series of strongpoints intended to prevent infiltration from the north. But rather than deterring attacks, these bases often invited them, becoming focal points for some of the war's most intense fighting. By September 1967, Contien had endured months of punishing artillery bombardment. North Vietnamese forces had positioned over 200 artillery pieces just across the DMZ, beyond the reach of American counter-battery fire due to political restrictions on crossing the border. From these sanctuary positions, they pounded Contien mercilessly, sometimes firing over 1,000 rounds in a single day. The Marines who defended the outpost endured these barrages in hastily dug bunkers and fighting holes, living in a nightmarish landscape of mud, shell craters, and concertina wire. The late summer monsoon had transformed the red clay soil into a quagmire, with trenches collapsing and bunkers flooding daily. Sanitation was primitive, disease rampant, and resupply missions hazardous as North Vietnamese gunners targeted helicopters attempting to land. "Contien was as close to hell as I ever want to get," wrote one Marine in a letter home. "It rains all day, they shell us all night, and we wonder if we'll wake up in the morning." The 3rd Battalion, 26 Marines arrived at Contien on September 15, 1967, relieving elements of the 9th Marines who had been defending the base for weeks. The fresh troops found their predecessors hollow-eyed and exhausted, many suffering from trench foot, dysentery, and the psychological effects of constant bombardment. Captain Richard Harrison, commanding Bravo Company, gathered his platoon leaders and key personnel, including Corporal Marcus Johnson, for a briefing shortly after arrival. "Gentlemen," Intelligence indicates the NVA is massing for a major push, Harrison explained, pointing to a mud-spattered map. We believe they're bringing up elements of the 324th Division. Their objective appears to be overrunning this base before the weather clears enough for our air power to be fully effective. The captain wasn't exaggerating the threat. The North Vietnamese 324th Division was a battle-hardened unit with approximately 7,000 troops, supported by artillery regiments and anti-aircraft battalions. Against them, the Marines at Con Thien numbered fewer than 2,000. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1, with the enemy holding the advantages of initiative and superior artillery support. Harrison continued, "Our job is to hold this position at all costs. If Con Thien falls, the entire DMZ defensive line could collapse." The gravity of the situation was clear to everyone present. Con Thien was more than just another firebase. It was a symbol of American resolve and a critical piece in the defensive strategy for northern South Vietnam. Its fall would represent not just a tactical defeat, but a significant strategic and psychological blow. During the briefing, Marcus studied the communications arrangements with particular attention. The firebase relied on a large elevated antenna for long-range communications with headquarters and air support units. This main antenna was a natural target for enemy artillery, and Marcus immediately recognized its vulnerability. "Sir," he asked Captain Harrison, "what's the backup plan if we lose the main comm antenna?" The captain's expression was grim. "We have auxiliary radios, but their range is limited without the main antenna. If we lose communications, we'll fire illumination rounds as an emergency signal." He paused. "But let's be honest, if it comes to that, help will probably arrive too late." In that moment, Marcus began thinking about contingencies, about ways to boost signal strength in an emergency, about improvisations that might save lives when standard equipment failed. He made mental inventories of available materials and contemplated modifications that went well beyond what regulations permitted. That night, as North Vietnamese artillery began its regular harassment fire, Marcus lay in his muddy fighting hole reviewing communication protocols and examining his radio equipment by flashlight. He made small adjustments to his personal ANPRC-25 radio, carefully documenting each change so he could restore factory settings if needed. "What are you doing to that thing?" asked Lance Corporal David Wilson, another radio operator who had become a friend despite the racial tensions that sometimes surfaced in the unit. "Just making sure it's ready," Marcus replied, not mentioning the unauthorized optimizations. "Something tells me we're going to need every advantage we can get." The following day, September 16th, passed in a haze of rain and intermittent shelling. Marines worked to improve their positions, digging deeper fighting holes and reinforcing bunkers with whatever materials they could find. Intelligence reports continued to indicate a major attack was imminent, and the atmosphere in the base grew increasingly tense. That evening, Captain Harrison summoned his radio operators again. "Latest intel suggests we can expect heavy action within the next 24 to 48 hours, he informed them. "Communications will be absolutely critical. If we need air support or artillery, every second will count. I want radio checks every hour, and I want everyone to have backup frequencies memorized." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to worst-case scenarios. What if the main antenna was destroyed early in the attack? What if standard protocols failed? What options would remain? He thought of his father's workshop back in Mississippi, of the improvised repairs they had made with household items, of the principles behind radio wave propagation that transcended the specific equipment designed to harness them. "Johnson, you look like you've got something on your mind," the captain noted. "Just considering contingencies, sir," Marcus replied carefully. "If we lose the main antenna, we might need to get creative." Harrison studied him for a moment. "Stick to your training, Corporal. This isn't the time for experimentation." "Yes, sir," Marcus answered. Though he had already begun mentally cataloging the materials he might need for modifications he hoped he'd never have to implement. As dawn broke on September 17, 1967, no one at Con Thien knew they were about to face one of the most intense attacks of the war. Nor did they know that before the day ended, conventional wisdom about field radio operations would be challenged by one Marine's desperate innovation. The morning began with the usual harassing fire, a dozen or so artillery rounds impacting around the perimeter, forcing Marines to take cover, but causing little damage. Then, at precisely 0900 hours, everything changed. The barrage began with a deafening crescendo as hundreds of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously from across the DMZ. Shells of various calibers, 130mm, 152mm, and devastating 122mm rockets, rained down on the Marine positions. The earth itself seemed to convulse under the impacts. Bunkers collapsed, and the air filled with shrapnel and debris. "Incoming!" The shout echoed across the firebase as Marines dove for whatever cover they could find. For nearly 30 minutes, the bombardment continued without pause, systematically targeting defensive positions, command bunkers, and critically, the communications center. Inside the main command bunker, Captain Harrison and his staff struggled to maintain control of the situation, but their efforts were hampered by the loss of communications with several platoons. Then a direct hit on the communications bunker destroyed the main antenna and killed 2 radio operators. "Johnson!" Harrison shouted over the din of explosions. "Get to the secondary comm position and establish contact with Da Nang. We need air support now." Marcus grabbed his radio and sprinted through the chaos, dodging shell holes and leaping over debris. The secondary communications position was little more than a reinforced fighting hole on the eastern edge of the perimeter. But it offered some protection and was pre-wired to connect with backup power sources. As he ran, he saw the devastation unfolding around him. Marines lay wounded in the open, medics struggling to reach them through the barrage. The fire base's defensive wire had been breached in several locations, and the perimeter was contracting as Marines fell back to secondary positions. Reaching the communications hole, Marcus immediately began attempting to establish contact with headquarters at Da Nang, some 40 miles to the southeast. But without the main antenna, his radio's effective range was severely limited, especially given the dense jungle and hilly terrain between Con Thien and Da Nang. "Lightning 6, this is Badger 3. Do you read? Over." Marcus repeated the call sign sequence, adjusting frequencies and power settings. Nothing but static answered him. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Through breaks in the smoke, Marcus could see North Vietnamese troops advancing toward the perimeter in human wave attacks. Machine gun fire chattered along the defensive line as Marines engaged the oncoming forces, but they were dramatically outnumbered. Lance Corporal Wilson crawled through the mud to Marcus's position, his face streaked with dirt and blood from a shrapnel wound to his cheek. "Captain says we've got maybe 30 minutes before they overrun us," Wilson gasped. "Regiment knows we're in contact, but without specific coordinates for airstrikes, they can't help us." Marcus nodded grimly. Standard procedure required precise coordinates for close air support, especially when friendlies were in such proximity to enemy forces. Without direct radio communication, those coordinates couldn't be transmitted accurately. "The backup antenna isn't strong enough," Marcus said, his mind racing through possibilities. "We need something with more gain, something that can push a signal through to Da Nang." "There's nothing left," Wilson replied. "Communications bunker took a direct hit. Everything's gone." Marcus stared at his radio, thinking of his father's workshop again, of the principles of antenna design, of the unauthorized modifications he'd been contemplating. What he was considering went far beyond minor adjustments. It would mean fundamentally altering military equipment in ways that violated every communication protocol in the manual. "I need copper wire, as much as you can find," Marcus told Wilson. "And I need the radio from PFC Rodriguez's position. He was monitoring the artillery net, so his radio should still be intact." "What are you going to do?" Wilson asked. "Something that'll either get us all killed or save our asses," Marcus replied. "Now go." As Wilson crawled away on his mission, Marcus began disassembling his radio with his multi-tool. The standard AN-PRC-25 used a short whip antenna that was durable and serviceable but limited in range. What Marcus envisioned was creating a directional antenna that would focus the radio's output power toward Da Nang, dramatically increasing the effective range. Wilson returned 10 minutes later with Rodriguez's radio and several lengths of copper wire salvaged from destroyed equipment. By this time, the North Vietnamese had penetrated the northern perimeter, and small arms fire was coming from increasingly close positions. "Captain says we've got maybe 15 minutes, Wilson reported breathlessly. "They've broken through near the western bunker complex." Marcus had already removed the casing from both radios and was studying the internal connections. What he planned went against everything in his training. Military radios were designed with specific impedances and power limitations to maintain system compatibility and prevent frequency interference. Modifying these specifications risked not only damaging the equipment but potentially creating a signature that enemy direction-finding equipment could lock onto. Yet the alternative was certain defeat. Without air support, Con Thien would fall, and hundreds of Marines would die or be captured. "Hand me your knife," Marcus said to Wilson, who watched in disbelief as Marcus began cutting into the radio's circuit board, bypassing safety limiters. "Johnson, that's against every reg in the book," Wilson protested. "The book doesn't matter if we're all dead," Marcus replied, not looking up from his work. His fingers moved with precision despite the chaos around them, connecting components in configurations never intended by the manufacturer. Using parts from both radios, Marcus was creating what radio engineers would call a high-gain directional antenna array. He used one radio as the transmitter, connecting it to the improvised antenna he was constructing from the salvaged copper wire. The second radio he cannibalized for parts, using its power amplifier to boost the signal strength beyond safe operating parameters. The modification was dangerous on multiple levels. The increased power output could damage the radio itself, possibly causing it to overheat or even catch fire. It would certainly reduce the operational lifespan of the equipment to mere minutes. More concerning was the possibility that the stronger, focused signal would make their position an obvious target for enemy artillery. Captain Harrison arrived at the communications hole just as Marcus was completing his modification. "Johnson, what in God's name are you doing to that equipment?" he demanded, taking in the disassembled radios and improvised wiring. "Making it work, sir," Marcus replied, not pausing in his efforts. "Standard configuration can't reach Da Nang, but this will. It's non-regulation, but—" "Non-regulation?" Harrison interrupted. "That's military equipment you're destroying, Corporal." "With all due respect, sir, in about 10 minutes none of this will matter if we don't get air support," Marcus answered, meeting his commander's eyes. "This modification will boost our signal strength by approximately 400% and focus it directly toward Da Nang. We'll burn out the radio in maybe 5 transmissions, but that should be enough." Harrison looked from Marcus to the approaching enemy forces and back again. The sound of firefights was now coming from inside the perimeter itself. "Do it," he finally ordered. "But if this fails, I'll have you court-martialed, if we live that long." Marcus nodded and made the final connections. The modified antenna system resembled nothing in the military inventory. A bizarre arrangement of copper wire stretched in a specific geometric pattern, connected to a radio with its internal components exposed and reconfigured. He calculated the direction to Da Nang and oriented the improvised antenna accordingly. Taking a deep breath, Marcus keyed the transmitter. "Lightning 6. This is Badger 3, emergency traffic over." For one heartbeat, there was nothing but static. Then, miraculously, a voice crackled through. "Badger 3, this is Lightning 6. Signal weak but readable. Send your traffic, over." The relief in the communications hole was palpable. Marcus locked eyes with Captain Harrison, who nodded in silent acknowledgement of the achievement. "Lightning 6. Badger 3. Broken Arrow, I say again. Broken Arrow. Firebase Canteen is in danger of being overrun. We require immediate close air support on the following coordinates." Marcus proceeded to relay the precise locations where airstrikes would be most effective while avoiding friendly positions. "Badger 3, Lightning 6 confirms Broken Arrow. Air support is inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Can you mark targets? Over." "Affirmative, Lightning 6. We will mark with colored smoke. Be advised, we are in close contact. Danger close procedures in effect. Over." "Understood, Badger 3. Hang tough. Lightning 6 out." As Marcus released the transmit button, the modified radio began to smoke slightly from the power overload. It wouldn't last much longer, but it had done its job. Air support was coming. "Get word to all positions," Harrison ordered a nearby runner. "Air support in 12 minutes. Mark enemy concentrations with green smoke when aircraft are overhead." The captain turned to Marcus. "I don't know how you did that, Johnson, but you just saved this firebase." There was new respect in his voice. Respect that transcended rank and race. "Just doing my job, sir," Marcus replied. Though they both knew what he had done went far beyond his job description. He had violated equipment regulations, protocols, and direct orders about maintaining standard configurations. In doing so, he had established communications that by all conventional wisdom should have been impossible. The next 10 minutes were among the most intense of the battle. North Vietnamese forces, sensing the firebase was about to fall, pressed their attack with renewed vigor. Marines fought from collapsed bunkers and shell holes, conserving ammunition and engaging only the most immediate threats. Marcus maintained the communication link with Da Nang, providing updates on the battlefield situation, even as his modified radio grew hotter and less stable with each transmission. Wilson helped him adjust the antenna orientation when shifting battle conditions required it. "Radio's not going to last much longer," Marcus warned after the fourth transmission. The unit was now visibly smoking, components beginning to melt from the electrical overload. "Just needs to hold until those planes get here," Harrison replied, firing his sidearm at approaching enemy soldiers. Then, precisely 11 minutes after the initial contact, the distinctive roar of jet engines cut through the battlefield noise. 4 F-4 Phantom jets appeared overhead, followed by a flight of A-4 Skyhawks laden with ordnance. "Mark targets now," Harrison ordered, and green smoke grenades arced into the largest concentrations of enemy troops. Marcus made one final transmission, confirming target markings and requesting danger-close strikes within 50 meters of Marine positions, far closer than normal safety protocols allowed, but necessary given how compromised the perimeter had become. The jets rolled in low, their 20mm cannons chattering as they strafed enemy positions. This was followed by the distinctive crump of bombs impacting just beyond the perimeter, where North Vietnamese reinforcements were massing for a final push. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy troops caught in the open were cut down by cannon fire or thrown into the air by bomb concussions. Their carefully coordinated attack disintegrated into chaos as supporting units lost contact with forward elements. As the jets made a second pass, the radio in Marcus's hands finally gave out completely, components fused into uselessness by the electrical overload. But it had served its purpose. The airstrike had broken the back of the North Vietnamese assault, and the Marines at Con Thien had gained the breathing room they needed to reorganize their defenses. Within 30 minutes, helicopter gunships joined the battle, systematically targeting enemy heavy weapons positions that had been spotted during the initial airstrikes. By late afternoon, the immediate crisis had passed, though sporadic fighting continued around the perimeter. The battle for Con Thien would continue for days afterward, but the firebase never again came so close to being overrun. Marcus Johnson's improvised communication solution had arrived at the critical moment, turning what seemed like certain defeat into survival. As darkness fell on September 17, 1967, Captain Harrison gathered what remained of his company's leadership in the damaged command bunker. The cost had been high: 27 Marines killed, over 60 wounded. But compared to what might have been, it was a miracle that anyone had survived at all. "Gentlemen, I won't sugarcoat this," Harrison began. "We were minutes away from being overrun today. The only reason we're still here is because air support arrived when it did." He turned to Marcus. "And the only reason that happened is because Corporal Johnson here decided to rewrite the radio operator's manual." The Marines turned to look at Marcus, who sat quietly at the back of the bunker, exhausted from the day's events. His uniform was caked with mud, his hands still smudged with soot and copper residue from his improvised antenna. "What exactly did you do to that radio, Johnson?" asked Lieutenant Peterson, the company executive officer. Marcus hesitated, aware that a full explanation would be an admission of violating multiple regulations. Captain Harrison nodded for him to continue. "I bypassed the power limitations and created a directional antenna from salvaged materials," Marcus explained. "Essentially, I concentrated all the radio's output in one direction, toward Da Nang, and boosted the signal strength well beyond specifications. It's not something the equipment is designed to handle for more than a few minutes, but it extended our range enough to get through." "Is that something they teach in communications school now?" Peterson asked. "No, sir," Marcus replied. "It's actually specifically forbidden. Standard configurations ensure system compatibility across units. What I did would have caused interference with other communications under normal circumstances." Harrison looked thoughtful. "But these weren't normal circumstances." "No, sir," Marcus agreed. "It was that, or nothing." The captain made a decision. "What happened today stays in this room for now. Officially, we restored communications through standard backup procedures. I'll report the full story through appropriate channels, but given the outcome, I suspect any potential disciplinary issues will be overlooked." The others nodded in agreement. What mattered was that the firebase had held, that hundreds of lives had been saved by one Marine's willingness to trust his training and instincts over rigid adherence to protocol. In the days that followed, word of Marcus's improvisation spread quietly among the Marines at Compiègne. Radio operators from other units sought him out, asking for details about his modification, taking notes on the principles behind his emergency antenna design. Staff Sergeant Collins, Marcus's old mentor, visited him at his position 2 days after the battle. "Heard you caused quite a stir with that radio trick," Collins said, squatting beside Marcus in his fighting hole. "Just did what needed doing," Marcus replied. Collins shook his head. "What you did was prove that sometimes the manual is wrong. That's a dangerous lesson in the military." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged. "But sometimes being too predictable is even more dangerous." "True enough," Collins agreed. "Word is, some communications officers at Division are very interested in your improvisation. Might be changing some protocols based on what you did." Marcus looked surprised. "They're not angry about the equipment damage?" Collins laughed. "Son, you saved a firebase and hundreds of Marines with a piece of copper wire and a modified radio. Nobody cares about the equipment." He grew more serious. "What you did matters, Johnson. Not just for the lives you saved that day, but for how we think about battlefield communications going forward." On October 1st, 1967, 2 weeks after the battle, Marcus was summoned to the battalion command post. He arrived uncertain of what to expect, perhaps formal recognition of his actions, or possibly reprimand for violating equipment protocols. Instead, he found a small group of communications officers gathered around a table covered with radio components and technical manuals. Among them was Major Robert Thornton, the division communications officer. "Corporal Johnson," the major greeted him. "We've been hoping to speak with you. Your Captain Harrison has written quite a detailed report about your improvisation during the September 17th attack." Marcus stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Corporal," Thornton said. "We're not here to reprimand you. Quite the opposite, in fact. We'd like you to walk us through exactly what you did to achieve that extended radio range." For the next 2 hours, Marcus explained the principles behind his modification, drawing diagrams and explaining the electrical theory that had informed his decisions. The officers took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions or discussing implications among themselves. "What's most remarkable," one captain commented, "is not just that you knew how to make this modification, but that you understood the principles well enough to improvise it under fire with salvaged materials." "My father taught me the basics of radio engineering when I was a boy," Marcus explained. "We often had to repair equipment with whatever was on hand." Major Thornton nodded thoughtfully. "Corporal, what you've demonstrated has significant implications for our field communications protocols. We've been too rigid, too focused on standardization at the expense of adaptability." He gestured to the components on the table. "We're developing a new emergency communications kit based on your improvisation, one that can be deployed when standard equipment fails." Marcus was stunned. His violation of protocol wasn't being punished, it was being institutionalized. "There will be a formal commendation, of course," Thornton continued. "But more importantly, we'd like you to help develop training materials for other radio operators. Your experience could save many more lives in the future." In the months that followed, Marcus worked with the communications staff to develop what would eventually be designated the AN-PRC-25E, an emergency modification kit that could be added to standard radios to achieve extended range in crisis situations. The kit included pre-cut wire, connection adapters, and simplified instructions for field implementation. By early 1968, radio operators throughout Vietnam were being trained in these emergency procedures, with Marcus's improvisation at Compiègne cited as the case study that prompted the development. What had been a desperate violation of protocol had become doctrine. Marcus Johnson returned to the United States in July 1968, having completed his tour in Vietnam. He received the Bronze Star with V device for valor, with his citation noting his exceptional technical knowledge and courage under fire during the defense of Compiègne. After his discharge from the Marines in 1969, Marcus used the GI Bill to attend college, eventually earning a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Mississippi. His military experience, technical knowledge, and innovative thinking made him a valuable recruit for telecommunications companies, and he began a successful career at Bell Laboratories in 1973. But the impact of his actions at Con Thien continued long after he returned to civilian life. The emergency communications protocols he helped develop became standard training for military radio operators. And the principles behind his improvisation influenced the design of subsequent generations of field communications equipment. In 1982, 15 years after that desperate day at Con Thien, Marcus received an unexpected letter from David Wilson, the radio operator who had worked alongside him during the battle. Wilson had remained in the Marines, eventually becoming a communications officer, and was now teaching at the Marine Corps Communication Electronics School at 29 Palms, California. "You probably don't know this," Wilson wrote, "but what we now call the Johnson modification is part of the standard curriculum here. Every Marine radio operator learns about what you did that day, about how thinking beyond the manual saved hundreds of lives. Your improvisation has become legend in communication circles." Wilson's letter went on to describe how the lessons from Con Thien had evolved into broader principles about adaptive communication in combat environments, principles that emphasized understanding the underlying physics rather than mere procedural compliance. "We had a visitor from the Army Signal Corps last month," Wilson continued. "He told me they've incorporated similar emergency modifications into their training as well. Your copper wire trick has spread across branches, Marcus. Not bad for something that could have got us court-martialed back in '67. In October 1992, on the 25th anniversary of the battle, a small gathering was held at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia. Among the attendees were several veterans of Con Thien, including Captain, now Colonel, retired Richard Harrison, and a dozen other survivors from the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. During the ceremony, a new exhibit was unveiled, a display case containing an ANPRC-25 radio and the emergency modification kit it had inspired. Beside it was a photograph of Corporal Marcus Johnson, taken shortly after the battle, his face still bearing the exhaustion and determination of that day. Marcus, now in his early 50s and a senior telecommunications engineer with a major corporation, stood before the display with mixed emotions. The radio represented both one of the most terrifying days of his life and one of his proudest achievements. "Never thought I'd see the day when breaking regulations got me in a museum," he remarked quietly to Harrison, who stood beside him. The retired colonel smiled. "It wasn't about breaking regulations, Marcus. It was about understanding when the mission demands more than the rulebook offers." He gestured toward the gathered veterans. Every one of these men owes their life to that understanding. Later that evening, at a dinner following the ceremony, Harrison rose to offer a toast. "To Corporal Marcus Johnson," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us all that sometimes the bravest act isn't following orders, it's knowing when to trust your own judgment instead." The veterans applauded, many with tears in their eyes as they remembered that desperate day when death had seemed certain until one radio operator's unconventional thinking changed everything. After the reunion, Marcus received more letters from Marines who had been at Con Thien but whom he'd never personally met. They all shared variations of the same message. Without his improvisation, they would not have survived to raise families, build careers, or grow old. One letter in particular moved him deeply. It came from a former Marine named Robert Sanchez, who had been a rifleman on the western perimeter during the battle. "I never knew your name until the reunion announcement," Sanchez wrote. "For 25 years, I've just called you the radio guy when telling my children why Daddy came home when so many others didn't. Now I can finally tell them your name and something about the man who gave me the chance to see them grow up." Such letters reinforced for Marcus that the true measure of his action wasn't in the technical achievement or even the formal recognition. It was in the ripple effect across generations, in the lives that continued because of one moment of inspired defiance. In the early 2000s, as the military underwent transformation for modern warfare, communication systems became increasingly computerized and automated. Yet the legacy of Con Thien remained relevant. Instructors at military communication schools continued to teach the Johnson principle, the idea that understanding the fundamental science behind equipment was more important than memorizing procedures. "Technology changes, but physics doesn't," became a common refrain in communications training, often attributed to Marcus, though he never actually said it. The essence of his innovation, using scientific principles to adapt when standard equipment fails, transcended specific technologies and remained applicable even as vacuum tubes gave way to transistors and analog systems yielded to digital ones. In 2007, Marcus was invited to address a class of communications specialists at the Marine Corps Communication Electronics School. Now in his 60s, retired from his corporate career but still active as a consultant, he stood before young Marines who had been born long after Vietnam, but who knew his name from their training. "I'm not here to tell war stories," he began. "I'm here to talk about what happens when everything fails, and you're the last link between your comrades and the support they need to survive." He described the principles behind his improvisation, without romanticizing the desperate circumstances that had demanded it. He emphasized that his modification hadn't been a stroke of genius, but the application of fundamental knowledge under pressure. "The manual exists for good reasons," he told them. "Standardization saves lives by ensuring compatibility and reliability. But when the manual fails, when following procedure means certain defeat, that's when you need to understand not just what to do, but why it works." After his presentation, a young lieutenant approached him. "Sir, I have a question that's been debated in our training sessions," she said. "Given modern equipment with built-in redundancies and stronger encryption, would your modifications still be necessary or even possible today?" Marcus considered this thoughtfully. "The specific technique wouldn't work with today's digital systems," he acknowledged. "But the principle remains valid. Modern equipment can fail in ways we haven't anticipated, especially against adversaries who are constantly developing new countermeasures." He paused, then continued. "What saved lives at Con Thien wasn't just the modification itself, but the willingness to attempt it when conventional options failed. That mental flexibility, that refusal to accept defeat because by-the-book methods weren't working. That's what you need to cultivate." The lieutenant nodded. "So the real lesson isn't about copper wire and antennas." "Exactly," Marcus replied. "It's about understanding your equipment deeply enough to improvise when necessary, and having the courage to try when lives depend on it." In 2017, 50 years after the Battle of Con Thien, the Marine Corps Communications Association established the Marcus Johnson Innovation Award, presented annually to the Marine who best exemplifies creative problem-solving in communications technology. The inaugural ceremony was held at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, with Marcus, then in his 70s, presenting the award himself. The recipient was a young sergeant who had developed a method for maintaining communications in electronically contested environments, where jamming and interference would normally render standard equipment useless. Like Marcus's innovation half a century earlier, it represented thinking that went beyond established protocols to achieve mission-critical results. During the ceremony, the association's president noted, "From copper wire at Con Thien to cyber warfare in the 21st century, the principles remain the same. When conventional methods fail, understanding fundamentals and having the courage to innovate makes the difference between success and failure, between life and death." For Marcus, the award ceremony brought his journey full circle. The scared young corporal who had cut into a radio with shaking hands, while shells exploded around him, could never have imagined that his desperate act would one day be celebrated as the foundation of a tradition of innovation. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by a retired general who had served as a junior officer in Vietnam, though not at Con Thien. "You know, Johnson," the general said, "in my 40 years of service, I observed something interesting about regulations and innovation. The military needs both, the discipline of following orders and the creativity to adapt when those orders don't fit the situation. Finding that balance is the real art of leadership." Marcus nodded. "It's a difficult balance," he agreed. "That day at Con Thien, I knew I was violating regulations, but I also knew we'd all die if I didn't. And that's precisely when innovation becomes not just acceptable but essential," the general replied. "The true discipline isn't blindly following rules. It's knowing the mission well enough to recognize when the rules have become an obstacle to achieving it. This philosophy, that true discipline includes knowing when innovation supersedes procedure, became increasingly integrated into military training across branches in the years that followed. As warfare evolved into more complex environments where communications faced sophisticated jamming, cyber attacks, and other electronic countermeasures, the ability to adapt and innovate became ever more critical. By 2020, Marcus's story had become more than just a footnote in Vietnam War history. It had evolved into a case study used not only in military training, but also in corporate leadership programs and engineering ethics courses. The Johnson scenario was presented to students and executives as an example of balancing procedural compliance with necessary innovation when lives or critical missions were at stake. In his final years, Marcus remained humble about his place in history. When interviewed for a documentary about innovations in military communications, he consistently emphasized that his actions at Compiègne had been born of desperation rather than brilliance. "I wasn't trying to change doctrine or make history," he explained to the interviewer. "I was just trying to get a signal through so we could survive another day." Everything that followed, the modifications to equipment, the changes in training, that came from others recognizing that sometimes you need to work outside the manual. When asked what he would want future generations to learn from his experience, Marcus thought carefully before responding. "I'd want them to understand that rules and procedures exist for good reasons, and you don't discard them lightly," he said. "But I'd also want them to know that understanding why things work, not just how to operate them, gives you options when standard approaches fail. And sometimes, having those options makes all the difference in the world." Marcus Johnson passed away peacefully in his sleep on August 12, 2023, at the age of 78. His funeral was attended not only by family and friends, but by Marines spanning multiple generations, from Vietnam veterans who had served alongside him to young communications specialists who had studied his innovations. The Marine Corps Honor Guard included representatives from the Communications Electronics School, and the ceremony featured a symbolic radio call using the actual restored ANPRC-25 that had been displayed in the museum. "Badger 3, this is Lightning 6, the communications officer intoned. "Your signal is clear. Well done, Marine. Over and out." As the echoes of Marcus Johnson's life and legacy rippled through the military and beyond, the essential lesson of Compiègne remained vibrant. Understanding fundamentals deeply enough to innovate when standard methods fail, and having the courage to act on that understanding when lives hang in the balance. His story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes, the most profound acts of courage involve not just facing physical danger, but daring to trust one's judgment and knowledge when conventional wisdom proves inadequate. It reminds us that heroism can take many forms, including the quiet, technical competence of someone willing to risk censure to save their comrades. In training facilities across all military branches, instructors continue to pose a challenging question to their students. What would you do if you were in Corporal Johnson's position? Would you follow the manual and accept defeat? Or would you have the knowledge and courage to improvise a solution? The question has no easy answer. It forces young service members to confront the complex realities of battlefield decision-making, where adherence to procedure must sometimes yield to the overriding mission of saving lives and achieving objectives. For civilians, Marcus's story offers equally powerful insights. In a world increasingly dominated by technological systems we're trained to use, but not necessarily understand, his experience highlights the value of deeper knowledge, of grasping the principles behind our tools, rather than simply following operational guidelines. His legacy challenges us to consider: do we understand the systems we depend on well enough to adapt when they fail? Do we have the courage to innovate when standard approaches prove inadequate? And perhaps most importantly, can we recognize those critical moments when adherence to procedure becomes an obstacle, rather than an aid to achieving our most important goals? These questions transcend military contexts, applying equally to healthcare, emergency response, business, education, and countless other fields where lives or critical outcomes may depend on balancing procedural discipline with necessary innovation. The Battle of Compiègne might have been just another forgotten firefight in a controversial war, remembered only by those who fought there. Instead, because of one radio operator's refusal to accept defeat when standard procedures failed, it became something more. A powerful lesson in the value of understanding fundamentals, in the courage required for innovation, and in recognizing when the mission demands more than the rulebook can provide. As we reflect on Marcus Johnson's story, perhaps the most profound question it raises is this: when faced with a crisis where conventional approaches are failing, would you have the knowledge to see alternatives? And would you have the courage to act on them? Would you have broken the rule or obeyed it? Share this story so others remember what courage really means.